When people talk about rock bottom, they usually mean financial ruin, heartbreak, or getting betrayed by someone they love. For me, it was none of that, not at first. It was something quieter, more invisible. You don't notice it while it's happening. You just start to feel less, like your background noise in your own life. And eventually, when someone finally says it out loud, when someone looks at you and says, "You're not my problem," it hits you like a truck. And in that moment, you realize you were never really part of the picture. You were just tolerated. Barely. My name's Brandon. I'm 22 now, but the story I'm about to tell started when I was 19. It wasn't the worst year of my life, but it was the year that changed everything. Back then, I was living with my mom in a small 2-bedroom apartment just outside Milwaukee. My parents had split when I was 11. My dad had moved out of state for work, then got remarried and drifted into his new life like I was just some souvenir from his past. He sent birthday cards for a while, then not even that. My mom and I had always been close, or at least I thought we were. She worked hard, double shifts at the hospital, and I tried not to be a burden. I did my chores, kept my grades up, never got into trouble. She called me her little man, even when I was old enough to tower over her. I thought that meant something. Then she met Ray. Ray was one of those guys who always had an opinion, even when no one asked. He was a manager at some auto shop chain, loud in a way that made everyone go quiet when he entered a room. Always wore a polo tucked into jeans like he was going to war with a wrench. At first, I didn't think much of him. She'd dated before, and it never lasted. But Ray stuck around. He had a way of making himself at home, reorganizing the kitchen to be more efficient, changing the Wi-Fi password without telling me, parking his beat-up truck in my usual spot. Little things, at first. Things that would seem petty to complain about. So I didn't. By month 3, he'd moved in officially. That was the first time my name disappeared off the lease. "He's just helping with rent," my mom said, brushing it off like it wasn't a big deal. "It makes more sense this way. You're still my son, Brandon. Nothing changes." But things did change. Suddenly, my late-night study sessions were disruptive. My part-time job at the local bookstore was a waste of time, according to Ray. He even made comments about my major, graphic design. Said it wasn't real work. One night, while I was microwaving leftovers, he looked at me and asked, "So what's the plan when your little art dream doesn't pay the bills?" Like I was a charity case crashing on their couch. I looked to my mom, waiting for her to say something. Anything. But she just kept scrolling on her phone. That was the first crack. Still, I told myself it was temporary. I was saving for community college, helping cover utilities, and trying to stay out of the way. I figured Ray would cool off eventually. Maybe he was just adjusting. Maybe he saw me as competition or some awkward extension of a life my mom had before him. Whatever it was, I thought it would pass. It didn't. Over the next few months, he made a sport out of subtle digs. Every time I came home from work, he'd raise his eyebrows like I'd just returned from a failed audition. He'd accidentally eat the food I bought, claim he didn't know it was mine. Once, I left my sketch pad on the coffee table, and he used it as a coaster. When I pointed it out, he said, "Maybe keep your toys in your room next time." Again, I looked to my mom. Again, she stayed silent. I should have seen the pattern earlier. The way she'd nod along when he complained about lazy kids these days. The way she started parroting his words, calling me sensitive whenever I tried to bring it up. Like the moment he came into our lives, her loyalty shifted. Not in a big, dramatic way, but in 1,000 small ways that added up to something I couldn't ignore. I remember one morning, clear as day. I'd woken up early for work, Saturday shift at the bookstore, and found Ray in the kitchen, drinking coffee from my mug. My mug. It wasn't just any mug, either. It was a hand-painted one I made in high school, covered in cracked blue glaze, chipped on one side. My mom had saved it for years, called it her favorite. Suddenly, it was Ray's. "Morning," I said, keeping it casual. He didn't look up, just sipped and said, "Might want to restock the creamer, buddy." "Cool. I'll add it to the grocery list I never see." That got his attention. He raised his eyes, gave me this smug little grin. "You pay rent, you get a say. I pay utilities. Utilities don't cover groceries, kid." I clenched my jaw, walked past him to grab my bag. But before I could leave, he added, "And maybe clean your bathroom. Starting to smell like a locker room in there." My room and bathroom were spotless. Always had been. I glanced at my mom, who was sitting on the couch tying her shoes. She didn't even look up. That was the second crack. The final straw, the one that made me pack my bags and walk out, came a few weeks later. I'd gotten into a car accident. Nothing major, thank God, but my old sedan was toast. I was fine, just banged up, bruised ribs, a sore neck, but I needed a ride from the hospital. My phone was at 12%. I called my boss, who said to take a few days off. I called my mom. She picked up on the third ring. "Mom," I said, my voice a little shaky, "I got into an accident. I'm okay, but my car's totaled. I'm at St. Vincent's. Can you come get me?" There was a pause. Then I heard Ray's voice in the background. "Tell him to call an Uber. He's not our problem." And my mom, my mother, the woman who once held my hand when I scraped my knee in third grade, the woman who used to say we were a team, sighed and said, "Brandon, I really can't right now. Ray's exhausted from work. Maybe ask a friend." I stared at the wall of the hospital room, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. My chest felt cold. Not from the accident. From something deeper. "I'm your son," I said quietly. She didn't answer. That was it. I didn't argue. Didn't yell. I hung up, called my coworker Ben, and waited. He picked me up, brought me to his place, let me crash on his couch. I didn't go back home that night. Or the next. I sent a text 2 days later. "I'll be by this weekend to get my stuff." No reply. When I walked back into that apartment 3 days later, everything felt smaller, colder, like the place had stopped being mine the moment Ray moved in. I packed slowly, quietly. My mom stood in the hallway, arms crossed, like she was watching a stranger. "You're really doing this?" she asked. I zipped up my duffel bag. "You already did." Ray leaned on the doorframe, arms folded. "Good luck out there, Picasso." I looked at him, then looked at her. She didn't say a word. So I left. Ben's couch was lumpy and smelled vaguely like pizza and dog, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. I remember just sitting there, blanket pulled over me, staring at the ceiling with that dull ache behind my ribs still pulsing from the crash, and from everything else. The hospital painkillers barely touched it, because it wasn't just my body that was bruised. It was the part of me that still believed my mom had my back, that some invisible line would never be crossed, that no matter what else happened, I'd never be told, "You're not our problem." I crashed with Ben for a couple weeks. He didn't ask questions, just handed me a spare key and cleared some space in the fridge. His roommate didn't even blink when I started doing the dishes or walking their golden retriever like I lived there. I worked double shifts when I could, skipped meals to save up, and quietly searched for a cheap room to rent. I didn't want to rely on anyone too long. I was raised to be independent, remember? To pull my weight. Funny how the people who preach that the loudest are usually the first ones to toss you aside when you need help. A week after I moved out, my mom texted me, "Hope you're doing okay. Let me know when you're ready to come by and talk." I stared at the message for a long time. Talk. Like I was the one who overreacted. Like I had walked out on a cozy family dinner instead of being abandoned in a hospital bed with a totaled car and cracked ribs. I didn't reply. I couldn't. Not without saying things I'd regret. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. But even when you leave, the past has a way of circling back. And in my case, it didn't take long. Ray had his fingers in everything. He'd always been controlling in subtle ways, replacing things without asking, rerouting the mail, adding his name to bills for convenience. When I checked my credit report for the first time in months, I found a hard inquiry I didn't recognize. Then another. I called the companies. One was a furniture store. The other? A payday loan place. Guess whose name had been used as a cosigner? That's right. Mine. He used my social. Somehow, he had it, probably from one of the old lease agreements or utility bills I'd signed when I was still living there. I filed a fraud report immediately, froze my credit, and spent hours on the phone disputing every mark. I didn't have the money to hire a lawyer, but I documented everything. Every call, every email, every statement. I even recorded the voicemail Ray left me when he found out I'd flagged the accounts. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," he said, voice calm but mocking. "We're family. You're not going to ruin my credit over a stupid loan, right? Be smart." That voicemail is still saved. I wanted to confront him, to confront her, but something in me held back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the voice in my head telling me, "No one's coming to save you. Not this time." So instead, I kept my head down and focused on what I could control, getting out, staying out, and making sure they couldn't touch me again. But they weren't done. About a month after I left, Ben came home with a weird look on his face. "Dude," he said, tossing his keys in the bowl. "Saw your mom at the grocery store. She was with Ray." I froze. "And?" "She pretended not to see me. But Ray didn't." He looked right at me and laughed. Said, "Tell the kid we're still using his room. It's a great walk-in closet now." That one stung more than I expected. A week later, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside, a bundle of my old clothes, stuffed haphazardly into a garbage bag. My favorite hoodie was missing. So were a few framed sketches I'd done in high school. There was a note, though, written in my mom's handwriting. "Figured you wouldn't be needing these anymore. Take care of yourself. Mom." No love. No apology. Just a garbage bag full of what little I had left from that house. I stared at it for a while, then shoved it under the bed. That was the third crack. The one that stopped trying to pretend it wasn't a break. Ben's lease ended in 3 months, and I didn't want to overstay. I picked up extra shifts, worked weekends, and managed to land a freelance gig doing logo design for a local gym. I poured everything into that job. Stayed up all night reworking mock-ups, learning new software, watching tutorials until my eyes blurred. The owner loved my work. Paid me more than I expected. Said I had a real eye for this stuff. That was the first time in months someone said something that felt like me. I eventually found a studio apartment above a laundromat. Cramped, but clean. Smelled like detergent 24/7, but it was mine. No Ray. No guilt. No garbage bags. And still no mom. Months passed. My credit slowly repaired. The fraud claims were still under investigation, but I had the documentation. I kept receipts of everything. Even started scanning old documents I'd taken with me. I didn't know what I was preparing for, but I knew I wasn't done. Not with them. Then, out of nowhere, she reached out again. It was a Facebook message this time. I hadn't blocked her, just muted the account. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. "Hi, Brandon. I know you're still upset, but I wanted to tell you that Ray's opening his own shop. It's a big step for us. We'd love for you to come to the launch party next weekend. It would mean a lot to have family there." Family. I laughed. Actually laughed. I didn't reply, but I did go to the event. Not to show support. Not to heal. I went because I needed to see it for myself, to understand how someone could look their own kid in the eye and choose someone like him instead. It was held at this ugly little strip mall 2 towns over. A big vinyl banner that said Ray's Auto and Tune flapped in the wind. I stayed across the street, hood up, watching people trickle in. A few old guys in mechanic shirts. Some family friends I barely remembered. And then I saw her. My mom. Wearing a brand new blouse. Smiling. She looked happy. I didn't recognize the woman on that sidewalk. She looked like someone who'd convinced herself she hadn't abandoned her only son. Ray came out a few minutes later, slapping backs and grinning like a politician. He had a mic in hand, calling everyone inside for the grand tour. Said it was a family dream come true. That's when I turned and walked away. But I wasn't done. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I remembered the furniture loan, the credit hit, the way Ray bragged about using my room, and how my mom had just packed my things and tossed me aside like a used napkin. So I started digging. It didn't take long to find the business listing online. The LLC paperwork was public, and that's when I noticed something odd. The co-signer listed for the initial lease on the shop? Brandon Keller. Me. I checked again. Same name. Same birth date. They had used my identity to secure the lease for Ray's shop. I sat there in my apartment, heart racing, staring at the screen like it might change if I blinked hard enough. But it didn't. It was right there in black and white. They hadn't just cut me out of their lives. They had used me to build a new one. And that was the breaking point. I didn't get angry. Not at first. I got quiet, focused, cold, and I started planning. I wish I could say I reacted like a rational adult when I found out they'd used my name to open the shop. That I took a deep breath, made a few calm phone calls, and trusted that justice would handle the rest. But I didn't. I just sat there in my tiny studio apartment, back against the fridge, laptop still glowing with the lease document on screen, as wave after wave of nausea hit me. I'd been trying to climb out of a hole for months, working myself half to death just to afford a place where I could be left alone. And now I realized they'd dragged my name back into their mess like I was some disposable resource. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the leasing company listed on the LLC forms. The woman who answered sounded cheerful, southern, the kind of voice you'd imagine working in a bakery. I gave her my name, calmly asked for details about the lease. There was a pause. Then she said, "Oh, you're Ray's stepson, right? We've been emailing that address since day one. Congratulations on the new business." I didn't even know what to say. My email hadn't received anything, which meant Ray, or my mother, had used a fake one with my name on it. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the floor for a solid 5 minutes. I had no lawyer, no family support, no money to hire someone, and worst of all, no idea how deep this went. That week, I went to the county clerk's office and requested every public document with my name on it. It cost me nearly $60 in fees, money I barely had, but I needed proof. I needed to know what else they'd rope me into. Turns out the shop lease wasn't the only thing. They'd opened a business credit card, used my information to sign up for local vendor accounts, and Ray had even listed my name on the website under co-founder and designer. The photos were from my old Instagram. He'd taken one of me working on a sketchpad and edited it to look like I was designing his logo. He must have pulled it from years back, before I ever locked down my social media. That was rock bottom. I remember sitting at my folding table that night, dinner untouched, just a bowl of cold instant noodles, and feeling like the world had shrunk around me. All I could think was, how do you fight back when you were never invited to the war in the first place? I wanted to scream. I wanted to storm into that shop, slam the paperwork on the counter, and demand answers. But that kind of story doesn't end with closure. It ends with cops and handcuffs, and another black mark on my record, not theirs. So instead, I did the only thing I could do. I took a breath, and I got to work. The first step was freezing everything. I contacted every credit bureau, refroze my credit reports, set fraud alerts, and opened a secured credit card with a $300 deposit just to start rebuilding my own credit again. I printed every document, scanned them, uploaded to cloud backups in case my laptop fried. I logged every phone call and time-stamped every screenshot. Then, I filed police reports. Not that I expected them to do much, but I needed a record, something official. And once I had a file number, I turned to the FTC and submitted identity theft affidavits. It was tedious, soul-crushing. I had to relive every decision, every betrayal. But with each form submitted, I felt a small, almost imperceptible shift inside me, like I was dragging myself, inch by inch, out of the hole they threw me in. The rebuilding wasn't just legal. It was personal, too. After weeks of freelancing odd design jobs for $50 apiece, I finally landed a steady gig with a local real estate agent. She wanted branding, flyers, a website revamp, social media templates. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid. And more than that, it trusted me. She didn't micromanage. She didn't undermine my work. She paid on time and even referred me to 2 of her friends. Word spread faster than I expected. In 3 months, I had 5 clients. Small ones, sure, but regular. Predictable. Enough to get me off instant noodles and into real groceries. Enough to replace my cracked laptop with a refurbished MacBook. Enough to start imagining a future again. I started going to local networking events, not as a scared kid looking for a break, but as a designer. I made business cards, got a cheap haircut, learned to talk about my work without apologizing for it. I wasn't just doing art anymore. I was building a business. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to prove myself to anyone. I kept tabs on Ray's shop from a distance. It was doing okay at first, lots of Yelp reviews from guys who probably knew him from the auto shop. The Facebook page was updated weekly. Photos of him handing over keys, holding wrenches, talking to customers. But then, slowly, things started to slip. A 1-star review popped up, tried to upsell me on parts one didn't need. Felt shady. Then another. Shop looked nice, but pricing didn't match what they quoted. Weird charges added to my invoice. And then a third. Wouldn't recommend. Something feels off about their billing practices. I screenshotted every single one. Meanwhile, I kept growing. I rented a tiny shared office in a co-working space, just a desk and a lamp, but it gave me a reason to wake up and go somewhere. I started getting bigger contracts. One of the gym owners referred me to a regional fitness franchise, and I landed a deal designing their entire brand overhaul. It paid well. I remember the first time I saw my own work in the wild. A billboard just off the freeway. Bright red. Sharp font. My design. I nearly missed my exit staring at it. It was around then that my mom reached out again. Not a call. Not a text. An email. The subject line was, "Can we talk?" It read, "Brandon, I know things between us are strained. I won't make excuses. But things haven't been easy for us lately. Ray's business is in trouble, and we're trying to figure things out. I just wanted you to know I miss you. Maybe we can talk soon. No apology. No acknowledgement of what she'd done. Just the usual dance. A nudge. A hint. Like she was testing the water to see if I'd come back. I didn't reply. Instead, I took out a sticky note, wrote, "Not your problem," and stuck it on my laptop screen. A reminder. Because here's the thing about rebuilding. It's not just about money or stability. It's about identity. Reclaiming who you are without the people who tried to define you. And every time I landed a new client, every time I fixed a piece of my credit, every time I showed up for myself, I felt that identity solidify. I was no longer the scared, ignored kid in someone else's house. I was building something of my own. And while they were busy spiraling, I was collecting tools, information, documents, dates, screenshots, statements, legal counsel. Yes, finally. One of my design clients turned out to be married to a small business attorney. We talked. I told her everything. She offered to help. People like Ray, she said, looking over the paperwork. They think they're untouchable until the paperwork crushes them. That was the first time I let myself imagine what that might look like. There's a specific kind of silence that settles in right before everything changes. Not the kind that's peaceful or comforting, but the kind that crackles with tension, like the quiet in the air before a thunderstorm. That's how the months leading up to my plan felt. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't drowning. I was waiting, watching, and gathering everything I needed to finally hit back. My studio was still small, but it looked different now. I had a new desk, a better monitor, an ergonomic chair that didn't wreck my back. My days were packed with client calls, designs, emails, and pitches. And every night, when the noise died down, I'd take out my Ray folder. That's what I called it. It lived in the drawer under my printer, thick with documents, lease forms, credit reports, screenshots, printouts of the business website, police reports, identity theft affidavits, and, most importantly, the official notarized statements from the leasing agent and credit card company confirming I was listed without permission. Some people would have gone nuclear immediately. Sued. Burned it all down in one go. But I wanted something better than chaos. I wanted control. See, Ray thought he was clever. He thought that by hiding behind my mother, by using her phone, her email, her trust, he could get away with manipulating my identity and dodging consequences. What he didn't count on was how much documentation comes with running a business, or how many people a business relies on, landlords, vendors, accountants, partners, and how, with just the right amount of pressure, those people will talk. The first step of my setup wasn't legal, it was informational. I started with a burner email account and created a fake business inquiry posing as a local supplier. I emailed Ray's shop asking about partnership opportunities, requesting tax ID verification and credit references. Ray didn't respond directly, but someone named Donna did. A quick LinkedIn search revealed she was Ray's assistant/bookkeeper. She attached the necessary documentation without even blinking, including a copy of the EIN assignment from the IRS, with my name listed as co-owner. Bingo. I cross-referenced it with the business license paperwork I already had. Same forged signature. Same fake email address tied to my name. That piece was huge, because now I had federal-level proof of identity fraud, not just local. I filed another FTC report and flagged it to my lawyer friend, Lauren, the one married to the attorney. She passed it on to her husband, Josh. He called me the next day. "I read everything," he said. "It's textbook identity fraud. We're talking fines, possible jail time, and civil penalties if you pursue damages. This is bigger than just some forged lease." I sat on the edge of my bed, gripping the phone. So what's next? We let them keep walking into the trap. And that's what I did. See, Josh said something that stuck with me. Revenge works best when it looks like justice, but feels personal. I didn't just want to expose Ray. I wanted him to feel it. To live in the consequences, day by day, as his shiny little empire crumbled. And so, the setup began. Step 1. Let the debt pile up. I knew from my monitoring that the business credit card under my name was still active. The balance had ballooned past $6,000. Ray was paying just enough to avoid default, but not enough to draw attention. I contacted the creditor, submitted my identity theft documents, and requested an immediate freeze pending investigation. that forced them to flag the account and notify the co-account holder, which, in their system, was Ray. He'd get a letter. He'd panic. He'd call the number listed. But the account was already locked. Step 2. Find the weak link. Donna, the assistant, turned out to be a gold mine. I created a fake Upwork profile posing as a freelance web designer and reached out to her directly, offering discounted rates on website optimization. After a few back-and-forth messages, she slipped. Mentioned how Ray doesn't even look at half the stuff he signs and barely knows what login goes to what account. I played dumb. Wow, must be a nightmare running all that. Oh yeah, she replied. I basically do all the back end. He just handles the shop. Exactly what I needed. I pulled every mention of that exchange, saved the screenshots, and added them to the folder. Donna had no idea she'd just confirmed that Ray wasn't just negligent. He was willfully avoiding responsibility while misusing my identity to build a business. Step 3. Push them toward collapse. I created a Google alert for Ray's Auto and Tune. Every time a review popped up, I was notified. I noticed a pattern. Customers were complaining about shady charges, late repairs, missing invoices. So I did what any thoughtful citizen would do. I compiled the reviews into a spreadsheet and anonymously sent them to the Better Business Bureau and the local Chamber of Commerce, attaching a polite cover letter suggesting there might be some consumer protection issues worth investigating. 2 weeks later, Ray's shop was under review. Step 4. Stir the family pot. This one was tricky. I hadn't spoken to my mom in almost a year. Not a word. But I knew she was still active on Facebook. Her profile was public, baby shower pictures, wine nights with friends, occasional quotes about family always finding their way back to each other. It made me sick. I created a second burner email. From there, I sent her a message. Hey, just wanted you to know your partner's shop is being investigated for fraud. You might want to check whose name is actually on the paperwork. You've been living off your son's name. Hope it was worth it. I didn't sign it, but I knew she'd know. And just like clockwork, 2 nights later, I got a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. Then a voicemail. It was her. Brandon, I got this message, and I don't know if it was from you, but please call me. I didn't know. I didn't realize what he was doing. Just, please call me. I didn't call. I saved the voicemail, added it to the folder. Step 5. Legal firepower. Josh filed the initial civil complaint on my behalf, citing identity theft, fraud, unauthorized use of personal information for business gain, and emotional distress. The lawsuit was structured to target both Ray and the LLC. But here's where it got good. Because I was still legally tied to the business on paper, I technically had rights to request full financial disclosure before the case. Josh filed a discovery motion. And guess what? The books were a disaster. Fake vendors, inflated expenses, side payments to consultants with no real invoices, personal vacations labeled as business development. We had it all. And because I was still listed as co-owner in the state filings, despite never consenting, I had the right to demand a full accounting, which meant I could also request access to their transaction history, tax records, vendor contracts, and even subpoena emails. Ray's business was a house of cards. And now, we were pulling on the first one. Meanwhile, I kept living, kept designing. My name started floating around local creative circles. A startup reached out for full brand development. I hired a friend from college to help me with admin work. Another friend handled client calls. I wasn't just freelancing anymore. I had a team. I opened a legit LLC. My name on the paperwork. My tax ID. And I called it Blue Ridge Creative, after the mountain range my dad once took me to when I was 6. The last good memory I had of him. I didn't just rebuild. I built something better. But the best part? Ray had no idea what was coming. He thought the issues with the credit card were just technical. That the reviews were bad luck, that the anonymous tip was some disgruntled ex-employee. He probably still laughed about me with my mom at night, calling me sensitive or dramatic or spoiled. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in early spring. Rain tapped against the courthouse windows like a metronome, steady and cold. I sat at the long oak table with Josh beside me, dressed in a proper gray suit and flipping through our neatly bound case file. Across the aisle sat Ray, still clinging to his denim jacket like it was armor, and my mother, arms folded tightly across her chest, looking anywhere but at me. It had taken over a year to get to this moment. A year of filing paperwork, gathering evidence, staying quiet while they walked around like they hadn't stolen my name, my credit, my trust. A year of building something of my own, knowing I couldn't fully move forward until I severed every last thread connecting me to them. And now we were here. The judge reviewed the case carefully. We'd provided every receipt, every document, every call log and screenshot. The fake email addresses, the co-signed leases, the unauthorized credit card, the altered EIN documents. Even the voice messages and social media posts, carefully timestamped, were included. It was airtight. Ray's defense, that it was a misunderstanding, that I had consented verbally to be listed as co-owner, though, conveniently, no such consent had ever been recorded, that I was too emotional to handle the family business, that I'd abandoned my family and was now trying to sabotage them out of spite. When the judge asked for documentation of this alleged verbal agreement, Ray tried to pivot. I mean, it was never written, but he lived with us. He ate our food. I assumed we were on the same page. Josh leaned in and said clearly, "Your Honor, you don't sign someone's name on a federal tax document because they ate your leftovers." There were a few stifled laughs from the courtroom observers. Ray's face flushed red. My mom's went pale. Then came the kicker. We'd issued a subpoena for Ray's email accounts through proper legal channels and found damning evidence. A chain of emails between Ray and the leasing manager where he explicitly asked how to add a silent co-owner to the shop without needing their ID. In the email, he said, "It's just my girlfriend's kid. He doesn't know we're using his name, but he'll thank us when we make money." That single sentence did more damage than everything else combined. The judge ordered the following: immediate removal of my name from all business licenses and documents. Liquidation of the business to repay damages and debts, with the court recognizing that Ray fraudulently obtained and used my identity. Financial compensation for emotional distress and reputational harm. Josh had wisely included my destroyed credit history and the loss of freelance clients early on due to fraudulent credit reports. A federal-level referral to the district attorney for criminal charges related to identity theft, falsification of tax documents, and wire fraud. Ray tried to protest. My mom finally stood up, voice cracking, saying, "But he's my son. Can't we handle this outside the courts?" I didn't even look at her. The judge responded coldly, "Then you shouldn't have used him like a scapegoat." That was the first time I felt it. Not victory, not triumph, just release. Like a rope had finally been cut from around my chest. They left the courtroom in silence. No eye contact, no apology, no closure, and I didn't need one. The liquidation process took 3 months. Ray's auto and tune was shut down, its assets seized and sold to cover the court-ordered compensation. The space was cleared out, signage removed. The banner that once read "family-owned" was rolled up and tossed in a dumpster out back. A new business moved in, an ice cream shop, of all things. I passed it one afternoon and couldn't help but laugh. From oil stains to sprinkles. Ray was arrested later that summer. Not in dramatic fashion, just a quiet knock at the door, a warrant, a pair of cuffs. I didn't watch the news coverage, but a friend sent me the mugshot. That cocky, smug expression was finally gone. In its place, someone deflated, exposed. He pled guilty to identity theft and fraud, part of a deal that would reduce his sentence in exchange for restitution. I didn't care about the time served. I cared that he had a record, that it would follow him the way his mistakes had followed me. As for my mom, well, a month after the court ruling, she showed up at my apartment. I hadn't given her the address, but she must have asked around. She knocked once, twice. I didn't answer. She left a letter under the door. "Brandon, I made mistakes. I let Ray convince me that what we were doing was harmless, that you'd be okay, that you didn't really need us. I know now how wrong that was. I lost my son, and I don't blame you if you never forgive me. But I'll keep trying to earn your forgiveness, if you'll let me. Love, Mom." I read it once, folded it, put it in the drawer with the rest of the case files. I didn't need her to grovel. I didn't need to reply. That letter wasn't for me. It was for her. A way to sleep at night. But I didn't know her anything. And I certainly didn't know her peace. My life moved on. The studio grew. I brought on 2 more designers. We moved into a better space downtown. I was invited to speak at a young entrepreneurs panel where I shared my story, not the revenge, not the personal parts, but the professional journey. About fighting for your name. About how identity is more than numbers on a form. One night, I was walking home from the office when I passed a man on a bench, slumped in a hoodie, holding a cardboard sign. I did a double take. It was Ray. Thinner, older, tired. The sign read, "Looking for work. Will do repairs. Please help." He didn't see me. Or maybe he did and chose not to react. Either way, I walked on by. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel satisfaction. Just a quiet awareness that karma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it's a long, cold fall from a very fake throne. Later that year, I updated the studio's mission statement. At the bottom of the About page, I added a single sentence. This brand was built from the ashes of betrayal, and it belongs to no one but its creator. I never looked back, and neither did they. I didn't realize how little I mattered to my parents until the day they told me I was too self-sufficient to worry about. They said it casually, like it was a compliment, like it explained everything. I was 28 at the time, sitting at the small kitchen table in the house I grew up in, watching my mother slide a stack of papers toward my sister while my dad nodded approvingly. That was the day they signed the family property over to her. Not because she earned it, not because she needed it more, but because, according to them, I'd be fine no matter what. My name is Elvis. I'm 34 now, and this is the story of how being reliable quietly made me disposable. Growing up, I was the easy one. The kid who didn't cause problems, didn't need reminders, didn't ask for much. If something needed fixing, I figured it out. If money was tight, I took extra shifts. If plans fell apart, I adjusted. My parents used to joke that I came out of the womb with a checklist. My sister, Marissa, was the opposite. She was emotional, impulsive, always in some kind of crisis that required immediate attention. Late rent, dropped classes, another relationship that ended badly, another big idea that needed funding. My parents hovered around her like she was fragile glass, while I learned early that praise was something you got for not needing help. By my early 20s, the pattern was obvious. When Marissa needed something, the family rearranged itself. When I needed something, I was told I'd figure it out. And I did. I moved out early, worked my way up in a logistics firm, paid my own tuition part-time, built savings. I showed up to every holiday, every birthday, every last-minute favor. I drove my dad to appointments when his knee started acting up. I fixed the leaking roof on weekends. I handled paperwork they didn't want to deal with. I thought that counted for something. The property was always this unspoken thing hanging in the background. A modest but valuable piece of land with the old family house on it, fully paid off, passed down from my grandparents. My parents talked about it like it was sacred. One day, this will keep the family secure, my dad used to say. I assumed that meant it would be handled responsibly. Maybe split. Maybe sold and divided. Maybe kept as a safety net for everyone. I never imagined I'd be sitting at that table watching it be handed over like a consolation prize. They didn't even frame it as a discussion. My mom cleared her throat and said they'd been thinking about the future. My dad said Marissa needed stability. Then came the line I still hear in my head. "You're strong, Elvis. You don't need a safety net. Your sister does." I remember looking at the papers, at Marissa's signature line already filled out, and feeling something quietly crack. Not rage, not shock. Just this slow, sinking realization that my role had already been decided, and no one thought to ask how I felt about it. Marissa avoided my eyes the whole time. She kept talking about plans, renovations, turning part of the house into a rental, using the equity to start a business. My parents nodded like proud investors. I asked one question carefully about loans, about debt, about what would happen if things didn't work out. My dad smiled and said I worried too much. My mom said we had to trust family. Then she added, almost kindly, "You've always landed on your feet. We know you'll be okay." I drove home that night in silence. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I didn't make it a scene. That's the part people always expect, the big confrontation. But something about being told you don't matter because you're competent takes the wind out of you. It turns anger inward. It makes you wonder when exactly being dependable stopped being a virtue and started being an excuse to overlook you. Over the next few years, the distance grew. Marissa took out loan after loan against the property. Every time she called, it was to talk about the next big thing, the next expansion, the next temporary setback. My parents backed her every time. When I cautioned them, gently, they accused me of being negative. When I offered to look over contracts, they said Marissa had it handled. When I stopped offering, no one noticed. Meanwhile, My own life kept moving. Promotions, relocations, long hours that paid off. I bought my own place without telling them until after the papers were signed. My mom said she was proud, but there was something flat in her voice, like my achievements were expected, not celebrated. My dad joked that I didn't need them anymore. I laughed along, because that's what I'd always done. The first real crack came when Marissa missed a loan payment. Then another. Suddenly, family dinners included tense whispers and phone calls taken in the other room. My parents started asking me questions again. What did I think they should do? Could I look at something real quick? I helped where I could, out of habit more than hope. But I could see where it was going long before they admitted it. The night they finally came to me, asking for help, wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No tears at first. Just my parents sitting in my living room, older than I remembered, hands folded, talking about foreclosure notices and stress, and how they didn't sleep anymore. My mom said they were scared. My dad said they needed stability. Then he looked at me and said, "You've always been the responsible one." That was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly. I nodded. I listened. I made coffee. But inside, I felt the weight of every time I'd been told I was fine. I didn't need support. I'd land on my feet. Now, suddenly, my independence was being reframed as a resource they could draw from. A solution to a problem I'd warned them about years earlier. I told them I needed time to think. That was true. What I didn't say was that I'd already been thinking for a long time. About fairness. About boundaries. About what family actually means when responsibility only flows one way. A week later, while they waited for my answer, I got a call from my company. The promotion I'd been working toward for years was finally on the table. New city. More responsibility. A clean break. I didn't tell my parents right away. I let the silence stretch. Their calls became more frequent, more urgent. My mom started framing things differently, talking about sacrifices, about how families stick together when things get hard. My dad mentioned how much they'd done for me growing up. Each conversation added another layer of pressure, another reminder that my value, in their eyes, had always been tied to what I could carry for others. The night before I was supposed to give them an answer, my sister called me. Not to apologize. Not to take responsibility. She said she needed me to step up. That it was unfair for me to walk away when everyone else was struggling. She said, "You don't even need that promotion. You're already doing fine." I stared at my phone after she hung up, the words echoing in my head. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about money or property. It was about a lifetime of being told my strength made me optional. I opened my email, reread the offer, and imagined what it would mean to finally choose myself. By the time my parents came over the next evening, their faces tight with expectation, I already knew what I was going to say. They came over the next evening with a tone that told me they thought the decision was already made. My mom brought a folder. My dad brought that familiar tight smile he used whenever he wanted to sound calm, while steering a conversation in a specific direction. They sat on my couch like guests waiting for good news, not parents asking for help. Before I could even say anything, my mom started talking about timelines. How quickly the bank was moving. How if I stepped in now, everything could still be saved. She said it like it was a shared problem, like I had been part of the choices that led them here. I listened. That's important. I didn't interrupt. I didn't raise my voice. I let them explain the situation in full, all the way down to numbers and deadlines and worst-case scenarios. My dad talked about how embarrassed he was, how he never thought he'd be in this position. Then, without missing a beat, he said, "But that's why we raised you the way we did, so you could handle things like this." Something in my chest tightened at that sentence. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest. They really believed this was the natural outcome of our family dynamic, that the reward for being responsible was inheriting everyone else's mess. When I finally spoke, I told them about the promotion. I didn't frame it as leverage. I just said it plainly. New role, different city, bigger commitment. My mom's face fell immediately. My dad leaned back like I'd physically pushed him. There was a long silence, and then my mom said, "So you're leaving now? When we need you?" I said I hadn't accepted yet, that it was an option, that I was weighing things. That part was true. What I didn't say was how their reaction had already tipped the scale. There was no congratulations, no pride, just disappointment, like my success was an inconvenience. That's when the conversation shifted. The tone changed. My mom started talking about everything they'd done for me growing up. The sacrifices, the roof over my head, the food on the table. My dad added stories about long hours he worked when I was a kid, like it was a debt ledger he'd been quietly keeping all these years. I'd heard versions of this before, but never this directly. Never with this expectation attached to it. I reminded them, carefully, that they'd made their decision about the property years ago, that I hadn't been consulted, that I'd voiced concerns that were dismissed. My dad waved his hand and said that wasn't relevant anymore. Families adjust, he said. We didn't know things would turn out like this. That was the first moment I felt real anger rise up. Not explosive anger. The kind that's cold and steady and sharp. Because they had known. Maybe not the exact details, but the pattern, the risk, the imbalance. They just assumed it wouldn't land on them. And if it did, I'd be there to catch it. When I didn't immediately agree to help, my mom's voice got tighter. She asked what kind of son lets his parents lose their home. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just let the words hang there, heavy and loaded. I felt my jaw clench. I asked her, calmly, what kind of parents decide one child deserves security and the other deserves responsibility without a say? She looked genuinely confused by the question. That's what hurt the most. Not offended. Not defensive. Confused. Like the idea that the decision had been unfair had never occurred to her. They left that night without a resolution, but the pressure didn't stop. If anything, it escalated. My phone started buzzing constantly. Calls, texts, messages framed as updates, but really designed to build urgency. The bank called again. We might need to make a decision this week. Your sister is under a lot of stress. Every message carried the same unspoken assumption that I would step in eventually, that this was just a matter of timing. Marissa ramped things up too. She stopped pretending this was about shared responsibility and started treating it like an obligation. She showed up at my place unannounced one afternoon, pacing my living room like she owned it. She told me I was being dramatic, that everyone was struggling, that if roles were reversed, she'd help me. I almost laughed at that, but something in her tone stopped me. She believed it. She genuinely believed she'd do the same for me, despite years of evidence to the contrary. I asked her a simple question. If the property had been signed over to me, and I'd run it into the ground, would she be offering to cover the fallout? She didn't answer. She changed the subject. That was answer enough. The real breaking point came a week later, when my parents asked me to come over to talk things through. I walked into the old house and immediately noticed something was off. Papers spread across the dining table. Not just bank documents. Legal ones. My dad looked tired. My mom looked determined. They told me they'd spoken to an advisor. That there might be a way to restructure things. To transfer some responsibility. My stomach dropped before they even finished explaining. They wanted me to co-sign. Not temporarily. Not as a last resort. As a long-term solution. They framed it as a technicality, a way to reassure the bank. My name, my credit, my future, tied to a property I didn't own and decisions I didn't control. When I pointed that out, my dad said, "It's just on paper. You know we'd never let it affect you." That was the moment I realized how completely they misunderstood what they were asking. Or maybe they understood and just didn't care. Because when I said no, clearly and without hesitation, my mom's composure finally cracked. She accused me of abandoning the family, of choosing money over people, of punishing them for a decision they'd made with good intentions. I told her the truth then, that the decision hadn't just hurt me financially. It had taught me exactly where I stood. That being too self-sufficient to matter meant my needs were optional, my opinions disposable, my boundaries inconvenient. I said it quietly. I didn't raise my voice, but every word landed hard. That's when my dad said something I don't think he realized would change everything. He sighed, rubbed his face, and said, "If you'd needed help like your sister, things might have been different." There it was. The confirmation I didn't know I'd been waiting for. Not denial. Not justification. Confirmation. That my reliability had cost me a place at the table. That if I'd struggled more, failed louder, demanded attention, I might have been considered worth protecting. I stood up. My hands were shaking, but my voice didn't. I told them I wasn't co-signing anything. I told them I wasn't stepping in to fix this. And I told them I was taking the promotion. My mom started crying then. Real tears, and for a second I almost wavered. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. But then she said something that sealed it. She said, "I never thought you'd be this selfish." I looked around that house. At the walls I'd painted. The repairs I'd done. The weekends I'd given up. And I realized this was the story they'd always tell, no matter what I did. I left without another word. The fallout was immediate. Relatives started calling. Some were subtle. Others weren't. I was told I was cold. Calculating. That success had changed me. No one asked why I was the only one being asked to sacrifice. No one questioned the decisions that led here. They just wanted a solution, and I was the most convenient one. The night before I was supposed to give my final answer to my company, my dad called me alone. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. He said the bank had given them a final deadline. He said he didn't know what they were going to do. Then he said, "I thought you'd always be there." I sat there in the dark, phone pressed to my ear, feeling the weight of that expectation settle fully on my shoulders. Not as love, as certainty. And as I stared at the email confirmation for my new role, one thought kept repeating in my head. If I give in now, this never ends. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was torn about the promotion, but because my entire understanding of my family had finally collapsed, and my mind wouldn't stop replaying every moment that led there. Every favor, every dismissal, every time I'd been praised for being low maintenance, like it was a virtue instead of a warning label. By morning, the exhaustion settled into something heavier than sadness. It felt like grief, but not for the house or the money. I was grieving the version of my parents I thought I had. I accepted the promotion before sunrise. I didn't dramatize it. No long speech. No satisfaction. I just clicked the button, read the confirmation twice, and sat there staring at the wall while my coffee went cold. When the relief finally came, it wasn't the kind people talk about. It was quiet, almost numb, like stepping out of a building after a fire alarm and realizing you're still shaking even though you're safe. Telling my parents was harder than accepting the job, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew exactly how they'd hear it. I waited a few days, long enough for the bank's deadline to pass, long enough for the consequences to feel real. When I finally called, my mom didn't answer. My dad did. His voice sounded older, tired in a way that went beyond stress. I told him I was moving, that I'd accepted the role. There was a long silence. Then he said, "So that's it." Not a question, a conclusion. I said I loved them. I said I hoped things worked out. He said nothing else before hanging up. That was the last normal conversation we ever had. What followed was the worst stretch of my life, and not because I was struggling financially or professionally. On paper, I was doing better than ever. New city, bigger salary, more responsibility. But emotionally, I was hollow. I'd lost my anchor. The people who were supposed to be my constant had turned into something unpredictable and conditional. I went days without talking to anyone outside of work. I unpacked my apartment slowly, like I wasn't sure I deserved to settle in. The guilt hit me in waves. Late at night, early mornings, random moments at work when I'd catch myself zoning out. I wondered if I'd done the right thing. If maybe I should have helped just a little. If drawing a hard line had been cruel. That internal debate was relentless because it wasn't really about money or responsibility. It was about identity. For most of my life, I'd been the one who showed up. The fixer. The reliable one. Walking away felt like abandoning not just my parents, but a version of myself I'd spent decades becoming. Then the calls stopped. Not gradually. All at once. No more updates. No more pressure. Just silence. At first, it hurt. Then it scared me. Then it confused me. And finally, it clarified something I hadn't wanted to admit. They didn't miss me. They missed what I could provide. A few weeks later, I found out through a cousin that the foreclosure process had officially begun. The house was going to be listed. My parents were scrambling for temporary housing. Marissa had disappeared from the picture almost entirely, claiming she was overwhelmed and needed space. That part stung more than I expected. Not because I felt responsible, but because it confirmed exactly how alone my parents had been left by the person they'd bet everything on. I didn't reach out. That was a conscious choice, and one I had to recommit to every day. Because every instinct in me wanted to step in, to offer solutions, to smooth things over. That instinct didn't disappear just because I recognized it was unhealthy. It took effort to sit on my hands and let things unfold without me. Work became my refuge. Not in a dramatic, throw myself into it way, but in a grounding one. Clear expectations. Measurable outcomes. Feedback that wasn't tangled in emotional debt. For the first time in my life, I was being evaluated purely on performance, not on how much I could absorb for others. I thrived in that environment, and that scared me at first. It made me realize how much energy I'd spent managing family dynamics instead of investing in myself. The real low point came a few months in, when my mom showed up at my door unannounced. I hadn't given her the address. She must have gotten it from someone at work or through extended family. Seeing her standing there, smaller than I remembered, holding a suitcase she clearly hadn't packed properly, knocked the air out of me. She didn't apologize. She didn't accuse me either. She just said she needed somewhere to sit for a while. That the temporary arrangement they'd made had fallen through. That she didn't know where else to go. For a moment, I almost let her in without thinking. Years of reflex kicked in. But then I noticed something that stopped me cold. She wasn't asking. She was assuming. I told her I couldn't. That my place wasn't set up for guests. That my schedule was demanding. All true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that letting her in would have reopened a door I'd just managed to close. Her face hardened immediately. She said she didn't raise me to be like this. That she never thought I'd turn my back on family when things got hard. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just said, quietly, that things had been hard for me for a long time too. She stared at me like she didn't recognize me. Then she left. I watched her walk down the hallway and disappear into the elevator, feeling like I'd just amputated something necessary to survive. That night, I hit what I can only describe as emotional rock bottom. Not despair. Clarity without comfort. I realized that no amount of success would ever be enough to earn unconditional support from my parents. That the version of love they offered came with terms I could never fully satisfy. Accepting that hurt more than losing the house ever could. The rebuilding didn't start dramatically. There was no big revelation. It started with small things. Therapy, which I'd avoided for years because I didn't think my problems were serious enough. Long walks where I let my thoughts spiral without trying to fix them. Saying no to things at work that weren't my responsibility. Not because I couldn't handle them, but because I didn't need to. I started making friends who didn't know my family history. People who met me as I was, not as a role I'd filled. I learned how strange it felt to be cared about without being needed. It was uncomfortable at first. I kept waiting for the catch, but it never came. Slowly, my sense of self shifted. I stopped measuring my worth by how much chaos I could contain. I started noticing how calm my life was becoming, how my weekends were mine, how my decisions didn't need approval or justification. That calm felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, but it grew on me. The final shift came the day my dad called me again. Months had passed. His voice was different this time. Not demanding, not disappointed, just flat. He told me the house was officially gone, that they were staying with a distant relative for now. He said, "I guess you really meant it when you said you weren't stepping in." I said I had. There was another silence. Then he said something that surprised me. Not an apology, not remorse. Just, "I didn't think you'd choose yourself." After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, phone in my lap, realizing that for the first time in my life, I had. And that choice had cost me more than I expected, but it had also given me something I'd never had before. The freedom to decide who I was without negotiating it with anyone else. I didn't know it yet, but that freedom was about to matter more than ever. The call with my dad lingered with me for weeks. Not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. No apology. No acknowledgement of the imbalance. Just quiet acceptance that the safety net they'd built for one child and denied the other had finally collapsed. And somehow, even then, I could tell they still didn't fully connect that outcome to their choices. To them, it was just bad luck. Circumstances. Timing. That's when I understood something fundamental. If I ever wanted them to truly grasp what they'd done, words would never be enough. They'd heard my concerns before and dismissed them. They'd heard my boundaries and tried to step over them. If there was going to be any reckoning, it would have to come from consequences they couldn't reframe or talk their way around. The opportunity didn't present itself right away. It never does. Life doesn't hand you neat revenge arcs with clear signposts. What it gave me instead were fragments. Small pieces of information that, on their own, didn't seem like much. But I've always been good at patterns. At noticing how things connect. It started with a voicemail from Marissa. I hadn't heard her voice in months, and hearing it again sent a jolt through me. She sounded frantic. Not dramatic frantic, the way she used to sound when she wanted sympathy. This was different. Tight. Controlled. She said she needed to talk to me. That it was important. That things were getting complicated. I didn't call her back right away. That alone was a new behavior for me. Old Elvis would have dropped everything. Knew Elvis listened to the message twice, noted what she didn't say, and waited. Over the next few days, more information filtered in through indirect channels. A cousin mentioned Marissa had been asking questions about liability. An aunt casually asked if I'd ever been listed on any family documents. A former family friend, someone who worked adjacent to local real estate, congratulated me on getting out when I did, then stopped talking abruptly when I asked what he meant. That's when I started digging. Quietly, methodically. I didn't hire anyone at first. I didn't want this traced back to emotion or spite. I pulled public records, property filings, loan documents, anything that was accessible without crossing lines. And the deeper I went, the clearer the picture became. Marissa hadn't just mismanaged the property. She'd leveraged it aggressively. Multiple loans, overlapping timelines, clauses that transferred risk in ways my parents almost certainly didn't understand. And buried in the paperwork, repeated over and over, was a phrase that made my stomach drop. Personal guarantee contingent on familial support. They hadn't just assumed I'd help. In some cases, they'd implied it. Not legally binding, not directly, but enough to reassure lenders. Enough to paint a picture of a financially stable sibling who could step in if needed. I wasn't named, but I was referenced. The idea of me, the assumption of me. I sat back in my chair and laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Even after writing me out of their plans, they'd still built their future on my existence. That was the moment the plan stopped being abstract. I wasn't interested in humiliating them. I wasn't interested in yelling or public confrontations or dramatic reveals. What I wanted was something much simpler and much more devastating. I wanted them to be forced to live inside the reality they'd created without my presence cushioning it. The first step was distance. Not physical, but informational. I stopped responding to extended family inquiries entirely. No explanations. No defenses. Silence has a way of making people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people talk. Within weeks, I was hearing versions of the story that barely resembled the truth. That I'd abandoned my parents. That I'd chosen money over family. That I'd been cold. I let it spread, because the louder the narrative became, the more brittle it was. And brittle stories crack under pressure. The second step was documentation. I started keeping records of everything. Messages, voicemails, indirect requests for help, comments framed as jokes that weren't really jokes at all. I wasn't sure yet how I'd use it, but I knew from experience that memory gets selective when accountability shows up. Around this time, Marissa finally cornered me. She showed up at my office building, claiming she just happened to be in the area. We sat in a neutral space downstairs, surrounded by people who didn't know us. And for the first time in our lives, she didn't have the advantage of history or family sentiment. She didn't waste time. She told me things were worse than I thought. That our parents were struggling more than they were letting on. That creditors were asking questions. That my name had come up. I asked her calmly why. She hesitated. Then she said something that confirmed everything. She said, "They always told people you'd step in if things got really bad." I nodded like this was new information. Inside, everything clicked into place. I asked her one question. Did she ever plan to include me in the upside? If the property had succeeded, if the investments had paid off, would I have seen any of it? She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "That's not fair. This isn't about that." But it was. It had always been. I told her I wasn't helping. Not now. Not later. And that if anyone contacted me again implying otherwise, I'd correct the record. Firmly. Publicly, if needed. Her face hardened, and for a moment I saw fear flash through the entitlement. Real fear. The kind that comes when a backup plan realizes it was never actually secured. After that conversation, the tone shifted across the board. My parents stopped asking for help and started talking about misunderstandings. About how maybe things had gotten out of hand. About how families make mistakes. The language softened, but the intent didn't. They weren't apologizing. They were repositioning. That's when I made my final decision about how this would play out. I didn't need revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't need them to suffer. What I needed was resolution. And resolution, I realized, wasn't going to come from confrontation. It was going to come from exposure. So I started preparing. I spoke to a lawyer. Not to sue. Not to threaten. Just to understand. To map out exactly where my obligations began and ended. To make sure there were no lingering ties. No assumptions that could be weaponized later. What I learned was reassuring and infuriating all at once. I was clean. Completely. Every attempt to link me to the fallout had been informal, emotional, assumptive. In other words, they had nothing on me, except expectation. The last piece fell into place when my company announced an internal restructuring, a public-facing one. Press releases, industry attention. My new role came with visibility I hadn't anticipated. Panels, interviews, features, the kind of professional credibility my parents used to brag about when it suited them. And suddenly, I realized the timing was perfect. Because when people who've rewritten the story about you are forced to watch the real version play out without their involvement, without their control, something interesting happens. They can't pretend anymore. Not to themselves. Not to others. I didn't know exactly how the final confrontation would unfold yet. I just knew I was done hiding. Done absorbing. Done being the invisible foundation everyone stood on without acknowledging. The reckoning didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, the way real consequences usually do, wrapped in timing and inevitability. By the time my parents realized what was happening, there was nothing left to argue about. The first public moment came sooner than expected. My company announced a major expansion initiative, and my role was featured prominently in the release. Industry blogs picked it up. A trade publication asked for an interview. A local business journal ran a profile that included my background, my career path, and a quote about independence and accountability that I hadn't even thought twice about when I said it. I talked about building stability through consistent choices, about not outsourcing responsibility, about learning when to step back and let people own the outcomes of their decisions. I didn't mention my family. I didn't have to. Someone else did that for me. An old family friend commented on one of the articles online, congratulating me and adding, "Your parents must be so proud." The reply chain that followed was educational. People who knew pieces of the story filled in gaps. Not maliciously, matter-of-factly. The house, the loans, the foreclosure, the fact that I hadn't been involved, that I'd moved on years earlier. By the time my mom called me that evening, the narrative had shifted beyond her control. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She sounded stunned. She asked why I hadn't corrected people, why I'd let them think things that made her look bad. I told her, calmly, that I hadn't said anything at all, that I wasn't responsible for managing other people's assumptions anymore. There was a long pause, and then she said something I hadn't heard before. She said, "I didn't realize people would see it that way." That was the moment it finally hit her. Not because of my feelings, not because of fairness, but because the story they'd told themselves didn't hold up once it left the family bubble. When the same choices were viewed without emotional cushioning, they looked exactly like what they were. My dad tried a different approach. He called a few days later and asked to meet in person. Neutral place. Coffee shop. No audience. I agreed, not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to close the loop cleanly. He looked older than I remembered. Smaller. Not broken, but stripped of certainty. We talked for a while about neutral things. The weather. The city. My job. Then he finally said what he'd come to say. He said they'd made mistakes. That they'd assumed I didn't need them. That they'd leaned too hard on the idea that I'd always be there. He didn't apologize directly, but he didn't deflect either. It was the closest he'd ever come to accountability. I listened. Then I told him the truth. I told him I wasn't angry anymore, that I didn't hate them, but that I also wasn't coming back into the role they'd designed for me. That my life was stable now because it didn't revolve around cleaning up other people's choices. That stepping in now wouldn't fix anything. It would just restart the cycle. He asked if there was anything they could do. I said yes. I said they could stop telling people I'd abandoned them. Stop implying I'd promised things I hadn't. Stop framing my boundaries as punishment. I said if they wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be one that didn't assume access to my time, money, or decisions. He nodded, slowly, like someone absorbing terms they didn't get to negotiate. Marissa didn't take it as well. When it became clear that I wasn't stepping in and that the extended family no longer viewed me as the villain, she unraveled publicly. She blamed the banks, the market, our parents, me. She told anyone who would listen that I'd changed. That success had made me cold. But something interesting happened. People started asking questions. Specific ones. About timelines. About decisions. About why she'd taken risks she couldn't back up. She stopped answering those questions. Eventually, she stopped showing up to family gatherings altogether. Last I heard, she'd moved again, chasing another opportunity, another reset. My parents followed a quieter path. Downsized. Adjusted. Learned. Too late. What it meant to live without a safety net they'd assumed would always exist. The final moment came months later, on a random weekday afternoon. My mom sent me a message. Not asking for help. Not asking for money. Just a simple statement. She said, "I understand now why you stepped away." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Then I sent back one sentence. I didn't step away. I stopped holding everything up alone. We don't talk often now. When we do, it's different. Careful. Limited. Real in a way it never was before. There's grief in that distance, but there's also peace. I no longer measure my worth by how much I can endure for others. I no longer confuse being needed with being loved. The revenge wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It didn't involve confrontation or humiliation. It was simply this. I lived the life they'd always assumed I'd sacrifice, and I did it without them. And in doing so, I finally learned what independence actually means.